late 80s and early 1990s was the beginning of a great change in the world, and the start of the modern era. The Cold War that had divided the world along ideological lines for decades was winding down, with several communist countries on the verge of collapse. There would be a new wave of social and political freedoms that would end several of the long-standing conflicts of the 20th century and set the ground for the new conflicts of the 21st century. However, one conflict from the last century persists, seemingly frozen in time. The Korean peninsula is still split into two parts, north and south, divided by a heavily fortified demilitarized zone that exists both as a painful reminder of the war that divided the Korean people, but also as this sort of relic of the Cold War itself. For decades, leaders of both North and South Korea have declared their intention to unify the country, but neither have come particularly close to this goal in a very long time. However, in 1989, during a period of experimentation by the North Koreans, one college student decided to try to make her dream of a unified Korea a reality, and according to some historians, may have actually come dangerously close to accomplishing her mission. This is the story of Lim Su-kyung, the flower of unification. In 1945, following the end of World War II, the Korean peninsula, which had been an independent kingdom before its colonization by Japan in 1910, was split in half between the Eastern and Western powers, with the stated goal of reunification of the peninsula in the near future, following a period of reconstruction and supervision. The North would be supervised by the Soviet Union, who had invaded Manchukuo, a northern Japanese puppet state, in the last few weeks of the war, while America, who had secured the ultimate surrender of Japan, would supervise the South. However, as Cold War tensions ramped up, negotiations and discussions between America and the Soviet Union about reunification of Korea fell apart, and over time, the two divided territories began acting as independent governments. Kim Il-sung, a Marxist, anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter, would be backed by the Soviet Union to become leader of the DPRK, also known as North Korea, while Syngman Rhee, a Korean independence activist who had spent many years in exile in the United States, would become leader of the ROK, or South Korea. Both these men desired unification of the peninsula, and were frustrated by the breakdown of negotiations over the issue, and also the rising tensions between their two supervising great powers. However, in 1950, emboldened by the success of Mao Zedong and Communist China in their war against the American-backed KMT, Kim Il-sung decided to try to bypass the gridlock of negotiations and reunite the country using military force. The Soviet-armed and trained North Korean army decimated the South Korean defenses and captured their capital city of Seoul within a few days. Within a matter of weeks, South Korea had lost over 80% of its territory to North Korea, leading to an American-led UN intervention to repel the North Korean army. This led to a Chinese intervention that eventually pushed the South Korean and American forces back down to the middle of the peninsula, where the war eventually stalled out and both sides agreed to an armistice. After 3 years of brutal fighting and casualty estimates that go up into the millions, the border between North and South Korea had gone from this to this. However, despite the Korean War coming to what many countries saw as an official end, the dream of unification never died, with both sides claiming to be the true legitimate government of the unified country. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, it seemed like the government that was going to unify the country was probably going to be North Korea. The North Korean army had decimated the South in their one-on-one conflict before America got involved, and North Korea's political climate seemed relatively more stable. With Kim Il-sung's rule lasting decades, while Syngman Rhee was forced out of power just about a decade after the war's conclusion. North Korea's economy seemed more stable since it had a manufacturing base left over from the Japanese occupation, and had powerful allies that were close by and motivated to protect its sovereignty. While the South Korean economy was very shaky, and their strongest protector was on the other side of the world with a deeply divided population that wasn't sure if it wanted to now be committing itself to overseas entanglements. However, as we know, America did continue to support South Korea, and North Korea, which, while troublesome for the South, never attempted a unification effort at the same level as they did in 1950. And as the world entered the 1960s, the dream of unification would begin to slip further and further away. South Korea would experience an economic boom known as the Han River Miracle that would eclipse the North Korean economy several times over. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung would develop his infamous Juche ideology that would see North Korea become more isolated and restrictive while celebrating virtues of national identity and self-reliance. In the late 80s, with the communist world on the verge of collapse, South Korea would take center stage by hosting the 1988 Olympics in Seoul. This had been a major diplomatic victory for South Korea, as it symbolized the warming of relations between the Western and Eastern worlds, as for the first time in over a decade, no major country boycotted the Olympics due to political objections. It was a sign of the changing world, and was also a smashing success for South Korea's image, and a massive humiliation for North Korea, who had demanded to co-host the Olympics with South Korea, and, after being rejected, led an unsuccessful boycott of the Olympics, and refused to even broadcast the event to their own population. It became clear that if Kim Il-sung and North Korea were ever going to recover from this embarrassment, they would have to do something big and spectacular. Luckily, the North Koreans were quite good at thinking big. If the North Koreans were ever going to hope to compete with the prestige and reputation of the Olympics, they would have to host their own international event that was meant to represent the oneness of man. And by 1987, they had found it. The World Festival of Youth and Students was conceived in 1945. The initial concept of the festival was to be a place for Europeans to meet and exchange cultures, and to promote peace in the aftermath of World War II. The vision and ambitions would grow for this, however, and would eventually include countries from outside Europe, including Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Oceania. The first festival would be held in 1947 in Prague, with roughly 17,000 people representing 72 different countries. More festivals would be held sporadically and mostly in the Eastern Bloc over the next couple years, with the most successful festival being held in 1957 in Moscow, which saw an estimated 34,000 people in attendance. This is also around the time when the festival began receiving heavy criticism from Western governments and anti-communist activists, who claimed the festival had become nothing more than a propaganda outlet for the Soviet Union, with allegations that the KGB had been directly involved in the creation of the festival, as well as noting that the theme of the festivals had been increasingly becoming more political and partisan leftist, and also citing that all the festivals had been held almost exclusively in communist Europe, with the exceptions being the relatively neutral countries of Austria and Finland, and Communist Cuba. North Korea decided that this would be the perfect event to mend their bruised egos and reaffirm their status as a leader in the international leftist movement. Planning for the event began in 1985, but North Korea didn't get official permission to hold the event until 1987. With the festival itself set to take place in the capital city of Pyongyang in 1989, just 1 year after Seoul's 1988 Olympics, making it the 13th festival to ever be held and the first festival to be held in Asia. One of the main themes of the festival would be anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, which North Korea would attach to their long-stated goal of reunification of the peninsula, and would also feature panels and discussions on, somewhat ironically, creating a world without nuclear weapons. While Kim Il-sung still reigned supreme over the country, the aging Kim decided to hand off much of the event's planning and preparation to his son and heir apparent, Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il took this effort very seriously, because given that this was an international event, this would be one of North Korea's first major attempts at opening up the country in the same way that countries like the Soviet Union and China had done before. Kim Jong-il was also notoriously very eccentric, with an eye for style and a passion for showmanship. According to his former mentor, Hwang Jung-yap, the younger Kim wanted to use this opportunity to build up Pyongyang to be this massive metropolitan city that could one day rival Seoul. This could also be a precursor to relaxing restrictions and punishments and boost North Korea's international reputation in countries that were traditionally outside of the communist world and sphere of influence. Since this would be one of the largest events the North Korean capital of Pyongyang had hosted, the Kims ordered a series of ambitious infrastructure projects to both facilitate and impress the mass of outsiders coming from pro-socialist and pro-communist countries or organizations. Pyongyang's international airport had to be expanded. A compound to physically house all of these new outsiders had to be constructed, since there was a lack of hotels and living arrangements. Also, this compound would help isolate foreigners so they did not interfere or over-observe the daily lives of North Koreans. Infrastructure projects such as building or widening roads had to be ordered and organized, and decorations had to be designed and distributed. North Korean citizens were drafted to complete all these projects through manual labor, creating posters, lining the streets with signs, and organizing parades or dance performances. Citizens that would be present in the capital during the event also had to be put through ideological and social training to help them interact with outsiders that were curious about their Juche society, and to make sure they gave appropriate responses to any sort of questions that people asked them, such as how, while at the moment South Korea was richer than North Korea due to the open markets, this wealth was only temporary and soon would face a collapse, as well as trivia questions such as the exact weight of the base that held up the giant Kim Il-sung statue in the middle of Pyongyang being equal to that of the North Korean people's love for Kim Il-sung. With over 100 events planned, the North Koreans began preparing highly choreographed dances, concerts, and acrobatic displays throughout the city to demonstrate the enthusiasm the citizens had for their country and their leader, Kim Il-sung. There would also be music and dance performances from foreign nationals throughout Pyongyang, which would be many North Koreans' first exposure to things such as rock and roll, leading to some surreal scenes of white Europeans dancing to disco under Juche Tower. The most impressive project undertaken in anticipation for the festival was the building of the Lungado May 1st Stadium, a structure to house all these performances and host the festival's sporting events with a max capacity of 150,000 people and a field of over 2 million square feet in size. At the time of its construction, this was the largest stadium in the world and would become a symbol of pride for North Korea. However, these projects would come at a cost and create several potential problems. North Korea's already stagnant economy was strained under the cost of all these infrastructure programs, which, according to Newsweek, was costing the country roughly $4 billion, causing the country to restrict some of its social services, most notably food rations. Even one of their biggest allies, the Soviet Union, privately criticized and derided the North Koreans for this expensive project that seemed to be putting some petty posturing above the conditions and well-being of their own population. There was also the issue of the North Koreans not only having to shepherd their own population that had been sheltered for so long through this monumentous cultural exchange, but there was also going to be an army of foreign journalists roaming the city, putting the event and the country itself under a microscope, and a high chance of an international incident given the large number of countries that would be participating, many of whom would be from communist countries that were on the brink of collapse due to popular revolt. Now, while the economic crunch that North Korea was experiencing could just be temporary, and the international incidents at this stage were entirely hypothetical, there were some very visible failures that North Korea experienced during the preparation for the festival, mostly surrounding their ambitious infrastructure programs. At several points during these programs, North Korean technicians found themselves way out of their depth and were forced to ask for assistance from East German engineers. The greatest example of the lack of ability of the North Korean engineers was the Su-gyong Hotel, a massive 1,083-foot structure meant to resemble a mountain that at the time would have been one of the top 10 largest buildings in the world. It was set to open alongside the May 1st Stadium, but the project was too complicated and the hotel failed to open before the festival. It still actually hasn't been completed to this day. However, these issues didn't seem to concern the Kims, who felt that regaining equal footing with South Korea, and thus their claim of rightful sovereignty over the peninsula, was all the justification they needed to endure these headaches. In fact, the North Koreans decided to take a more personal approach with their vendetta. Since they had been directly humiliated by having their bid to co-host the Olympics rejected, made worse by their boycott of the '88 Olympics failing, North Korea began to think of ways to directly humiliate the South while also making their case for unification to a global audience. North Korea wanted a more direct strike at the South by recruiting their own citizens to make the case for unification for them. And it seemed like South Korea was going to let them do it, because while North Korea was gearing up for what many thought would be its grand opening to the world, South Korea had just completed its own transformation. In 1979, long-serving authoritarian President Park Chung-hee was assassinated by a member of his inner circle. The sudden removal of somebody who was arguably South Korea's most consequential president left a power vacuum in the country. There was a civilian government established led by Chae Kyu-ha. However, this government was short-lived, as many members of the military realized the weakness of Chae's position in power and decided to act. In just under 2 months into civilian rule, a group of high-ranking military officials led by Major General Doo-hwan launched a military coup that essentially gutted the civilian government and handed all real decision-making powers to Chun before officially handing Chun the title of president a few months later. These actions caused a massive backlash in several parts of South Korea, most notably the southern city of Gwangju. The city erupted into large-scale protests that eventually devolved into street fighting as the police and military attempted to clamp down on the protesters. As the situation spiraled further and further out of control, with the protesters managing to acquire firearms, Chun ordered that the military put an end to this uprising once and for all. What followed has been dubbed the Gwangju Massacre, which saw hundreds of people being beaten, arrested, killed, or disappeared. One of the figures seen as most responsible for the massacre was a member of Chun's inner circle named General No Tae-woo, as he had played a key part in directing and organizing the response to the protests in Gwangju. The response by South Koreans who were aware of what happened in Gwangju was almost universally negative, and it's something that Chun's reputation never fully escaped. However, Chun would remain in power for several years, and No would abandon his connection to the military in favor of several high-ranking bureaucratic and ministry positions, even being appointed by Chun to lead South Korea's Olympic Committee. No's close relationship with Chun eventually got him the ultimate promotion. In 1987, Chun announced that he had completed his one constitutionally allowed term as president, and thus would be handing off power to his close confidant and supporter, No Tae-woo. Chun announcing that he was essentially just going to appoint a new president without any direct input by the people of South Korea sparked a whole new backlash against the government, which was already facing massive protests nationwide after a college-age democracy activist was allegedly tortured to death while in police custody in January of that year. The 1987 June struggle called for direct elections in regards to the presidency and the lifting of several restrictions on press and political freedoms. Initially, the military tried to crack down on the protesters, much like they had done years before, but the protests continued to grow until they were in almost every major city, including Seoul. The anger against the Chun government and the dream of democratization seemed too strong to stop. Chun, realizing the futility of resistance at this point, announced that he would open up the country to the very first direct elections for president in its history. And despite the massive backlash against him and the Chun government that he was connected to, No Tae-woo believed that he could win the election and become president all on his own. The 1987 election is very interesting for several reasons. One, it saw the attempted transformation of No Tae-woo from the fierce military enforcer to this humble, everyman character. This rebranding did work in a lot of respects, and did gain him a wide base of support in several parts of Korea, especially the more conservative-minded parts. No was also able to make some inroads in liberal areas as well, by distancing himself from the unpopular Chun government. However, this rebranding did not really take hold in Gwangju, which can be seen when No Tae-woo attempted to campaign in the city, and his rally devolved into street fights, protests, and No Tae-woo's entourage trying to shield the candidate from projectiles using placards of his face. We would also see the rise of several Chun Doo-hwan critics who would now become prominent mainstream political figures whose candidacies would come to symbolize the drastic changes that the country was experiencing during this short period of time. However, No Tae-woo was able to rally enough support while his opponents failed to unify before the election, leading to No Tae-woo being elected president with just over 30% of the vote in an election that to this day still holds the record for the highest level of turnout in any Korean presidential election. Now, as mentioned before, in the late 80s, the world was changing. And this was something that now President No Tae-woo recognized. With the title of the first directly democratically elected president of South Korea, Tae-woo began changing South Korea to be more liberal. Domestically, he would approve several reforms that greatly increased the political freedoms of South Koreans, but his more talked about reforms were diplomatic reforms. Using a diplomatic strategy that became known as Nordpolitik, South Korea would begin the process of easing tensions and normalizing relations with much of the communist world. The first major breakthrough being normalizing relations with communist Hungary. Now, when it came to relations with North Korea, Nordpolitik would, at best, open up diplomatic channels to North Korea by having South Korea connect to North Korea's greatest sponsors and closest allies. And at worst, create a situation where the communist world now had to make a choice between the two Koreas that it didn't have to before. And South Korea could leverage its greater economic value as a trade partner to make relations with South Korea more appealing. Thus, you could believe that this would be the perfect time for North Korea to request permission to allow South Koreans to enter their country so that they can participate in an international peace festival. There would even be talk of some sort of North-South Korean student exchange program as late as December of 1988. However, the No government had become extremely hostile to this very specific type of request. Relations between the two Koreas was already frosty, given North Korea's attempt to step in and co-host the 1988 Olympics with South Korea, then their attempt to boycott the 1988 Olympics, and their attempt to derail the 1988 Olympics by using two North Korean agents to blow up a South Korean passenger plane. While all that had damaged relations between the two Koreas, what ultimately made getting permission for this exchange impossible was the fact that North Korea had already done something similar to this. In March of 1989, Moon Ik-hwan, a pastor from South Korea, entered into North Korea to meet Kim Il-sung without permission from the No government or from the Ministry of Unification. Pastor Moon's stated goal for going to North Korea was to advocate for a peaceful unification of the two Koreas, but what ended up happening in the eyes of the No government was Pastor Moon was trotted around and was used as a tool for North Korean propaganda. The whole event was an embarrassment for the South Korean government, and President No did not want a repeat of this situation. So he ordered the Ministry of Unification to reject any and all applications for students to go to North Korea for the purpose of attending the festival. It made it clear that anybody that attempted to enter North Korea would be prosecuted under the country's National Security Act, an act that was created in the early years of South Korea that gave the government the power to arrest anybody and ban any organization that was suspected of working with the North Koreans to subvert the South Korean government. It became clear to the North Koreans that if they wanted a South Korean delegation, they would not get it easily. And any South Korean that agreed to collaborate with them would be putting themselves in extreme danger. Still, though, the North Koreans were determined and began looking for any sort of group or individual that would be willing to risk everything for the cause of unification. Luckily for them, in the latter years of the Chun regime, there had been a rise in left-wing counterculture within South Korea, and they were able to find an organization that was willing to help them in exactly the ways they needed. After decades of authoritarianism in South Korea, the 1980s saw the development of a very visible anti-conservative counterculture. that demanded radical change both within South Korea and South Korea's relationship with a number of different countries. Initially, many of the political groups and protest movements that came out of this counterculture were focused on democratization. However, after the 1987 election, many of these groups began to shift their focus towards Korean unification activism. Now, many of these groups politically leaned leftist, and a lot of their activism in regards to Korean unification was about re-examining South Korea's relationship with the North. Whether that be seeking common ground with the North and trying to increase cooperation that could eventually lead to some sort of unified country, or directly advocating for and supporting the North Korean government. One of the largest and most infamous groups to come out of this time was the South Korean Federation of University Student Councils, or as it was known at the time, Jong-il. Jong-il could best be described as a left-wing nationalist movement. It sought unification through working with North Korea rather than conquering it, and denounced and protested against the South Korean government and its relationship to the United States, which they saw as an imperialist power and an obstruction to unification. These ideas had become fashionable in the latter years of the Chun regime and the early years of the Tae-woo government. And this had allowed Jong Dae-op to grow in prominence and size by staging rallies and protests against the government and the active American military presence in South Korea. This would be the group that in late 1988, North Korea would reach out to for its plan to invite South Korean students to attend its festival. The North Koreans wanted Jong Dae-op to form a delegation that would initially lobby the Minister of Unification for approval to attend the festival, but after the 1989 ban on private citizens visiting North Korea, the strategy evolved to illegally sneaking a small delegation into North Korea. This was an extremely dangerous request by North Korea. After all, Jong Dae-op was under near constant surveillance by the South Korean security forces, given its history of extreme anti-government protests and rhetoric. And if the security forces got wind of this plan, many of Jong Dae-op's members could be arrested and detained under the National Security Act, as they would be labeled traitors for collaborating with North Korea. There was also some internal concern about the damage that could be done to Jong Dae-op's reputation and potentially galvanize the South Korean public against Jong Dae-op and also against unification as a cause. However, after watching news footage of Moon Ik-hwan's physical embrace of North Korean leader Kim Il-sung on TV, Jong Dae-op's leader, the charismatic and passionate student Im Jong-suk, said that he was inspired to continue his mission to send the delegation. The delegation would end up being 6 Jong Dae-op members that Im felt represented the average spirits and emotions of South Korean college students. One of the representatives chosen was a French language major from Hankook University named Lim Su-kyung. Lim Su-kyung was an aspiring novelist from a stable middle-class background. She is said to have become sympathetic to left-wing politics following the mysterious death of her older brother, who died during his 2-year mandatory military service. She didn't become a full-blown activist until 1987, during the June struggle, where she joined anti-government protests in the wake of the death of a university student named Lee Han-yol, who was fatally wounded after being struck by a tear gas grenade. She would continue her activism by joining Jong Dae-op the next year, wanting to focus her newfound political awareness on the cause of unification. Before the festival, Lim wasn't very prominent in the organization. She didn't lead any rallies, she never gave any speeches. Her job was primarily focusing on advertising and editing posters. However, Lim's lack of any experience as a professional speaker or activist made Im feel that she was the perfect representative to send to North Korea. She was a supporter and member of Jeondaeop, but she could give the North Koreans a look into the life of an average South Korean girl. Since there were no civilian flights between North and South Korea, the initial plan for the representatives were that they were going to fly to Japan, and from there fly to Western Europe, cross into Eastern Europe, and meet a representative that would help fly them to Pyongyang. Lim decided to leave for Japan a week early to get preparations in order, with the rest of the group set to join her later. However, her departure had been leaked to a local news agency, who had reported that a Jeondaeop member had left South Korea with the intention of going to the Festival of Youth and Students. The South Korean police immediately started raiding Jeondaeop offices and detained several members of Jeondaeop's leadership and the other 5 representatives, although Im Jong-suk managed to escape. Lim was now completely alone. She had no one coming to help her, no reliable contacts in South Korea, and was about to travel around the whole world to go to a country that she was taught from birth to hate. But for Lim, she felt she had no option. So, after arriving in Europe, she crossed into Eastern Germany and prepared to take a 40-hour flight to Pyongyang to be South Korea's sole representative. Finally, in late June of 1989, Pyongyang opened its doors to a flood of festival goers who were ready to see what the city had to offer. People from every corner of the globe arrived in North Korea by plane and by boat, filling Pyongyang with excitement. For many foreign analysts, they believed this would mark the beginning of a more open and globalized North Korea. But as the days went on, momentum and fascination continued to build around the festival's guest of honor, the student representative who was said to have defied her government to attend this event in the name of unification and peace. Finally, after 10 days of traveling the globe, Lim Su-Kyung landed in Pyongyang, and she was given her first taste of what the next few weeks in North Korea was going to be like. When Lim landed in Pyongyang, she was greeted by dozens of foreign journalists and hundreds of enthusiastic North Korean supporters. After being mobbed by the crowd, Lim gave a short speech where she declared herself a representative of Jeondaeop, described her 10-day journey to reach Pyongyang, and boldly declared,
전대협은 평양에 도착했습니다. 전대협은 평양 축전에 참가할 것입니다. 그리하여 남과 북의 청년 학생들이 하나가 되어 반드시 조국 통일 염원을, 조국 통일을 반드시 이루고야 말 것입니다. 자랑스런 조국 통일 투쟁 만세! 감사합니다.
After her speech, Lim was pushed through the crowd and into a car that would drive her through the city, where she would see thousands of North Koreans lining the streets just trying to get a glimpse of this sensational figure. Seizing on this momentum, the North Koreans would give her the title of the Flower of Unification.
Do you know why Im Su-kyung carried such a significance? That's because if somebody behaves like she did, the third generation, 3 generations of the family will be wiped out among. But then she came all the way just, to prove the legitimacy of North Korean regime. Because of that, we North Korean residents, had that pride as North Korean people.
The best example for how serious every level of the North Korean government was taking Lim Su-kyung's presence at the festival could be seen the next day after she arrived. The North Koreans scheduled a day-long opening ceremony for the festival that would start with an Olympic-style parade of countries that would go through the city and end up going through the May 1st Stadium, where they would be greeted by Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and a number of foreign heads of state that would be attending the festival. Lim would participate in the festival as a representative and would receive a lot of attention by North Korean media sources who narrated glowing praise over footage of her marching through the city and chanting to a starstruck North Korean audience. As representatives from around the world began filtering in through the stadium, Lim and the unified Korean delegation made their way to the back of the parade, so that the representatives from the host country could end the event before the start of the opening ceremony, celebration, and performances. This led to a very interesting juxtaposition between the North and South Korean delegation, and clearly showed what part of the festival the North Koreans wanted to put emphasis on. At the tail end of the festival, the North Korean delegation is the first to enter. It is relatively massive compared to the other delegations, and all the members are wearing matching uniforms. And when they pass by the booth holding Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, they begin fanatically raising their hands up into the stands, cheering and waving the North Korean flag, which is met with a cheerful and respectful wave by the two Kims. After the North Korean delegation moves on, the rather lonely-looking Lim enters. While the North Korean delegation was allowed to display their country's flag, Lim had to make do with displaying the flag of Jong-il, since the festival had banned the display of the South Korean flag during the parade. It's striking how casual her attitude and dress are compared to the North Koreans, dressed in a t-shirt as she wanders into the place where she is supposed to wave up at Kim Il-sung and the rest of the world leaders. However, when she gets into place, the tables turn, where Kim Il-sung leads a standing ovation to celebrate Lim and her presence at the festival. He is quickly followed by Kim Jong-il and the other visiting foreign heads of state, as the world's largest stadium erupts into thunderous applause and cheers. Here she was, the heroine of the Unification movement, come to fight to bring the two Koreas together. And, just like that, the moment passed. Lim took a bow and walked out of the stadium with the rest of the delegates, and the opening ceremony began. Although this was not the last time that Lim and Kim Il-sung would see each other. In fact, shortly after the opening ceremony, Lim would be invited to attend an in-person meeting with the Supreme Leader himself. A meeting that would become one of the most defining moments of Lim's adventure in North Korea. The meeting was said to have been brief, but it featured an emotional Lim embracing Kim Il-sung before he led the room in a toast. There has been a fair amount of analysis of these moments during the festival. In the book, Twice Crossing and the Price of Emotional Citizenship, the author contextualizes this scene from the perspective of both gender and contrast, and suggests that the latter meeting with Kim Il-sung was an attempt to course correct and reframe Lim and Kim's relationship as that of a wise fatherly figure and a traditional approval-seeking daughter.
This moment presents a highly unusual aesthetics in North Korean media, where the focus is conventionally reserved for the male leadership, whether intentionally or by accident. The documentary film continues to show Lim on par with the leaders in their ability to act in an improvised manner, a freedom not bestowed on the North Korean people. However, following the opening ceremony, the documentary quickly departs from the visual logic of equating Lim with the Kim leadership. Lim appears in modified traditional Korean dress, and bows her head deeply upon encountering Kim Il-sung, who greets her with fatherly warmth and authority. The modified traditional dress could be seen as a carefully chosen sartorial code for the occasion. This transformation tames the body of the unbridled visitor, to fit the North Korean sensibility. Thus displayed, Lim's public persona is diminished from a rebellious border crosser to a model female.
Lim's entrance electrified an already energetic festival. With over 1,000 events crammed into the week-long celebration, it was clear that North Korea was doing everything it could to impress its visitors. From sports exhibitions, music performances, monstrous rallies, and the most up-to-date urban housing that North Korea had to offer, all done with the country's trademark flair and spectacle, the city of Pyongyang looked at times like a neon socialist wonderland. Its attendance would be estimated at 22,000 representatives, which was incredibly impressive for a country that had been so isolated. It was not, however, the largest festival in the event's history, despite what North Korea would itself claim. It did, however, have the distinction of being the most international festival that had been held at the time, with 177 countries sending representatives and participants to Pyongyang, destroying the Soviet Union's record of 157 participating countries set just 4 years earlier. However, sometimes North Korea's massive projects and desire to maintain control over the experiences of both foreigners and locals would tip the scales from spectacular to bizarre.
The city was big, and they have newly built roads, very big roads actually, but almost no cars. So it was kind of strange, and there was a lot of people. They were greeting us in some sort of, a lot of children standing with flowers and waving hands and stuff like that. We didn't believe at the time that it was spontaneous, but I think they were actually quite curious. We had this guy that were following us all the time, so we had to sneak away from him, and we managed to do that. But after a while, there was a new guy turning up, say, "Hello, how are you?"
What was shocking to me was that all the questions were regarding things that were unthinkable to us North Koreans. For example, you have to do such and such when a foreigner is trying to kiss you. That scenario is like, in and of itself, was unthinkable to us North Koreans. So that's why, all the subjects were very sensational to us. They tried to keep the foreigners from us. So one time I was in the bathroom. But then, all of a sudden, those officials, I assume they are government officials, they shoved everybody into like one toilet. And that was, later on, we realized that was because a foreigner had to use the bathroom. Yeah, for us, it was very, obvious. We were not supposed to have contact with foreigners. We were not supposed to meet them.
This even generated a few protests and acts of disobedience, something that North Korea was not particularly used to dealing with. There had been some protests denouncing North Korea itself from foreign delegates over North Korea's decision to not allow Amnesty International to attend the festival, as well as a protest by the Swedish delegation against the delegation from China.
In the opening ceremony, this was, it was very close to the Chinese protests.
Yes, just 4 weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre.
In the opening ceremony, the Swedish delegation did a protest. It wasn't our idea. We had some politicians with us, and we had a banner with some sort of message. And we all took on, white headbands. Nothing happened at the time, but they made a video of the opening ceremony, and we were, of course, not on it. And on the closing ceremony, we were separated from each other, and we were sitting together with North Korean, I would say some sort of policeman or something like that.
North Korea managed to successfully and peacefully deal with these protests, so word of them did not spread very far and did not upset the overall mood of the festival. And even if there was a problem with the festival, reports of it would be buried under the weight of the coverage surrounding the festival's star, Lim Su-kyung. Back in South Korea, however, the mood around Lim's arrival was much less joyous. After failing to prevent Lim's arrival, the Tae-woo government attempted to downplay the significance of her attendance at the festival. While they condemned her for being a tool for North Korean propaganda, they said that her attendance was insignificant to Korean affairs, with one government official remarking, "One girl can't change the world." On the ground, however, the police and army continued frantically searching for Im Jong-suk and cracking down on John Dae-up and raiding their offices and headquarters. While in hiding, Im continued to voice his support for Lim, releasing statements to the media that, while conceding that Lim had violated the National Security Act, what she did was, quote, "an act of patriotism that is consistent with the will of the people." However, there were several segments of society that were strongly against Lim. Other leftist student unification movements, such as the PD, which stated that they felt Lim's actions in North Korea was counter to the mission of unification, and went as far as to condemn it as treasonous. Other, more conservative elements of South Korean society took a more dramatic tone with the news of Lim's arrival. In between Moon Ik-hwan's visit and Lim Su-kyung's arrival, it had been revealed that two other South Koreans had illegally entered North Korea. One was author Hwang Suk-young, and the other was a politician from a leftist political party. This led to a wide range of fears, with some believing that there was a concerted effort by left-wing agitators to brainwash students like Lim, others believing that there was an active fifth column of North Korean supporters inside the government and other institutions that were going to rot the country from the inside. Lim's arrival at the festival kicked up a lot of debate, anger, and paranoia in South Korea, with the people feeling most of the pressure being her family. Lim's parents and siblings were completely unaware of her plans to go to North Korea, only learning about them after finding a note left in her room after she had already departed to Tokyo.
Members of my dear family, please forgive me for leaving a scar on my parents' hearts. But your daughter is on no account a criminal. I love the southern land of my divided country, and also the northern land, because it is part of my country which should be unified. Mom, you wanted me to become a journalist. Dad, you wanted me to become a writer. But I am no longer the daughter of you alone. I wish to be an honorable daughter of a united country. Your last daughter will return to your embrace without fail. I wish you good health.
Still, they would face repercussions for Lim's actions. Lim's sister would be suspended from her college, while her father's job as a public transportation manager would be threatened by his bosses. The pressure that Lim's family felt from this whole ordeal would get so bad that Lim's father would write a letter apologizing for his daughter's actions, in an attempt to disassociate him and the rest of the family from her. This would be an action that Lim's father would later say he regretted taking. Back in Pyongyang, Lim was also feeling a tremendous amount of pressure. From the moment she landed, Lim became the standout figure of the festival, always surrounded by an entourage of supporters and being followed by international news agencies who would pepper her with questions. With all this attention on her, Lim quickly morphed into a unification firebrand, attending anti-imperialism conferences put on by North Korea, visiting unification art shows in Pyongyang, and marching in many, many rallies. During these activities, Lim would often hold an impromptu speech or a press conference, where she would passionately promote John Dae-up's messages and demands, or sometimes just explaining parts about her life growing up in South Korea, to highlight the division that had grown between the North and South.
남한에서 태어나서, 제가 태어난 서울이거든요. 서울에서 태어나서 서울에서 국민학교, 중학교, 고등학교를 다니고 그다음에 대학교도 지금 다니고 있고 계속 생활하고 있으면서 저 역시도 그 반공 교육을 받았고, 그다음에 저 역시도 약간의 그 반북 그 이념이 있습니다. 그래서 저도 저희들은 그런 거 많이 하거든요. 국민 학생들한테 반공 그림 대회, 글짓기 대회 이런 거 하면은 저희들은 이제 북한의 사람들을 그릴 때 항상 얼굴은 빨갛게, 그다음에 이렇게 뿔 이렇게 나고요. 이렇게 그립니다. 이렇게 그리고 또 북한 공산당 어쩌고 그러면서 항상 지금도 아마 우리 국민 학생들은 북한 사람들 그리려고 하면 빨갛게 아마 그릴 겁니다. 미국은 지금 현재까지도 우리 민족의 생존을 위협하고 있으며, 그리고 민족의 통일을 가로막는 가장 큰 장애물은 바로 이 땅에서 45년간 우리 민족에게 범행을 저질러온, 야수적인 만행을 저질러온 미국이라는 것을 저는 여러분 앞에 확실하게 이야기하고 싶습니다. 가로막는 미국 놈들 몰아내자!
However, Lim's favorite activity of the festival was meeting other student representatives from North Korea. This, like many aspects of the festival, had a political bent to it, such as Lim's meeting with the North Korean Students' Committee that ended in a joint declaration of unification.
이제 북한함의 우리 청년학생들은 시대와 민족 앞에 지닌 숭고한 사명과 임무를 깊이 다하고 제13차 세계 청년학생 축전이 진행되는 여기 평야에서 하나의 조국, 하나의 민족을 위한 공동의 선언을 내외에 알린다.
1. 우리는 자주 평화, 민족 대단결의 원칙에 따라 조국을 통일하기 위하여 끝까지 투쟁한다.
This isn't to say that all the things Lim did while in Pyongyang during the festival were serious and political. Lim had several opportunities to engage in the lighter side of the World Festival, such as making rice cakes, competing in marathons, riding roller coasters, and being invited to a number of cultural shows. One such example was when Lim was invited to be the guest of honor of a performance of the North Korean opera, The Flower Girl.
Yes, she came sweeping into the theater the night we saw The Flower Girl. It was this wonderful stage musical, which was sort of a North Korean version of Les Miserables.
Ah, yes.
And everybody was so excited to see her because she was beautiful and she had defied her own government to come and see them. And the North Koreans were really touched and moved by her.
The Flower Girl is set during the Japanese occupation of Korea, and the story is about a young Korean woman who sells flowers to support her family, who all work under a greedy Japanese-backed landlord. Her brother becomes a brave resistance fighter who abandons his family to wage war against the Japanese from the mountains. The Flower Girl at one point enrages the landlord's wife, who has her locked away, causing her brother to come down from the mountains and lead a revolution against the landlord and push him and his Japanese backers out of the village. After the show, Lim was given a bouquet of flowers to give to the cast. She was expected to give it to the actress who played the Flower Girl, but ended up passing her to give it to the actor who portrayed the greedy landlord. Her reasoning, she said, was that the actress who played the heroine always receives the most applause, and she felt that for once the villain should be rewarded for his performance. However, this kind sentiment was said to not have been appreciated amongst the cast and the North Korean officials in attendance.
In an instant, the hall became quiet, and there was silence. Even the face of the actor was completely frozen. I don't think that man had ever received a bouquet of flowers. But people reacted so badly that I realized that what I did was wrong. It was probably unprecedented in North Korean history.
This would be one example of what would be many of friction between Lim Su-kyung and her vision of what a unification activist is and what North Korea wanted a unification activist to be, with the North Koreans believing that a unification activist should primarily support North Korea and its ideology while denying the legitimacy of South Korea, both of which Lim felt varying degrees of discomfort advocating for. This led to some of Lim's highly publicized adventures being products of negotiation and compromise. One such event was Lim Su-kyung's visit to Kim Il-sung's birthplace, something that visiting non-North Koreans are asked, or in some cases demanded to do, as a way of paying tribute to the country's supreme leader. Lim initially refused this request, but the North Koreans managed to convince her to go in exchange for allowing her to visit other parts of North Korea. This isn't to suggest, though, that North Korea won all of these negotiations. In his autobiography, The Prisoner, Hwang Yuk-sung, the author who had illegally entered North Korea to meet Kim Il-sung before Lim, detailed a number of ways Lim exerted her independence. A few things that she refused to do were to sing any songs that glorified the North Korean military, opting instead to sing songs that celebrated ideas of peace and unification, or songs affiliated with Jeondayeop. Another small thing that she did while in North Korea was that she at one point wore a cape that had the South Korean flag drawn on it. Lim wanted to wear it to show that she was a South Korean and a representative from South Korea. But for North Korea, it advertised South Koreans as a distinctly different group with their own identity. Nevertheless, this is all behind-the-scenes friction, and for most of the festival, Lim was able to have a healthy working relationship with her North Korean guides and handlers. And she had many opportunities to do what she wanted to do, which was interact with North Korean students, which caused a new problem that the North Koreans did not anticipate. For you see, many North Koreans were enamored with Lim Su-kyung when she arrived in Pyongyang, but not just for the message that she was delivering. Many were very fascinated with the way that she looked. Because although Lim was a Korean, she didn't look like any Korean that the Northerners had seen before. The clothes that she wore when she arrived in Pyongyang, and the clothes that she wore a lot of times when she was out interacting with people in Pyongyang, were very modern and westernized. She wore t-shirts, jeans, sneakers. She cut her hair short. This wasn't the way that North Korean women presented themselves, given North Korea's emphasis on promoting traditional gender roles.
And everyone was talking about her how she presented herself, how eloquent she was. And I remember my classmates, after seeing her style, because even me, everyone loved her style, and everyone just cut the hair like her, and it was quite exciting. So she became kind of a revolution, Lim Su-kyung revolution in the city. There's no one wearing a jean in North Korea, so to wear or to buy jean was impossible. But what they did, my classmate, was they copied her hairstyle.
Lim would also give these improvised speeches in public where she was loud and confident and spoke with authority, something that again was not something that women in North Korea typically did. And the fact that Lim was ethnically a Korean and not a Canadian or a Russian made it so that these differences couldn't just be dismissed as an outside culture with no relatable foundation.
I mean, because of our visit, we actually had some kind of like a yearning for South Koreans. We were very impressed because, first of all, she was very, pretty. She came with those bobbed hair, and she was cute. And then the pants that she was wearing, I can't really describe what mambo bazi is, but that was very stylish from our perspective. And I also remember she was very, very eloquent. And we were just thinking, like South Koreans are very, very like eloquent. Everybody can deliver such a good speech. She looked so free. She was pretty much doing what she wanted to do. And like in North Korea, that is not an option.
In North Korea, public speeches were not normally made by women. But Lim made powerful speeches, without any embarrassment, and without a script. To say she looked cool really doesn't do it justice.
There is no doubt that many South Korean students, at that stage at least, sincerely believed that North Korea was a viable alternative to the capitalist South. which was seen by progressive intellectuals as an underdeveloped victim of U.S. neocolonialism, regardless of the subjective beliefs of Ms. Lim herself and the calculations of her handlers. Her trip to Pyongyang inflicted a major blow to the then officially approved image of South Korea, allegedly a place of destitution and poverty. North Koreans noticed that the girl looked healthy and optimistic and was very well dressed. Even though she did not say anything to contradict North Korean slogans, her apparent sincerity and the ease with which she spoke was striking, and so very different from what the North Korean public was used to.
Initially, Lim's popularity allowed her to stay in North Korea for a few days after the closing ceremony, where she and a number of other peace activists from around the world would continue staging rallies and protests. But Lim couldn't stay in Pyongyang forever, and so finally the decision was made to send Lim home. But Lim didn't want to return home the same way she had arrived. She wanted to do something that was historic, dangerous, and meaningful to the unification movement. She just didn't want to fly home through a third country. She wanted to go home directly, by crossing the DMZ. Following the signing of the armistice between North and South Korea and the establishment of the demilitarized zone, Korean citizens lost the ability to move freely between the North and South, which is why South Koreans that wish to enter North Korea have had to go through multiple different countries, whether that be Czechoslovakia or, in Lim Su-Kyung's case, East Germany. For unification activists, the fact that so much effort has to be put in to travel between two countries that border each other and both outwardly proclaim their desire to be unified is ridiculous. In fact, one of the first things Lim did when she arrived in North Korea was point out this absurdity.
그리고 4천만 결의가 조국 통일을 외치며 투쟁하고 있습니다. 저는 그 6월 21일 서울에서 출국을 했습니다. 자동차로 불과 4시간이면 올 거리를 저는 24시간을 비행하면서 그리고 열흘이라는 시간을 걸려서 이곳에 도착을 했습니다. 남한에 계신 전대협의 100만 학도 여러분.
To protest this inhumane divide, Lim stated a number of times her intentions to return to South Korea by crossing the DMZ, specifically crossing it at Panmunjom.
저를 허가를 안 해주신다면 저는 그 자리에서 죽는 한이 있더라도 저는 제3국을 경유해서 돌아가고 싶지는 않습니다. 반드시 판문점을 통해서 남한 땅으로 돌아가겠습니다.
How are you going to do this?
그리고 그 노래를 부르면서 손을 흔들면서 노래를 부르면서 갑시다.
Panmunjom, aka the JSA, is the area of the DMZ where North and South Korean officials can meet to discuss diplomatic issues and have negotiations. No average Korean citizen from either the North or the South had ever crossed the DMZ openly before, and doing so would be a violation of the 1953 Armistice Agreement, but Lim was determined. This was going to be her grand exit from North Korea, and so a date was picked, July 27th, the 36th anniversary of the end of the Korean War and the signing of the Armistice Agreement. News that the flower of unification was attempting to cross the DMZ reportedly shocked and worried a lot of North Korean officials. There were obvious concerns for her safety, given that the border between North and South Korea was, and still is, one of the most dangerous borders in the world, and there were also political concerns that the North Koreans were looking at. In their minds, they had just completed a successful propaganda victory against the South. All they needed to complete their victory was for Lim to return home like other visiting South Korean activists had done, through a third country, and in South Korea they could face whatever consequences they had coming. Lim had pushed her exit from the country into a political battle, where she would be facing off not just against President Tae-woo and the South Korean government, who had already stated their opposition to Lim crossing, but also against the United Nations, who helps enforce the armistice agreement. Nevertheless, many North Korean officials supported Lim and wanted to push this issue, and saw it as an opportunity for a PR victory, having the South Koreans being the one to actively oppose citizens crossing between the two Koreas, which they felt would strengthen North Korea's claims to being the true champion of unification. As July 27th grew closer and closer, a new group would enter into the fray to try to help Lim achieve her goal: the South Korean Catholic Church. After many years of authoritarianism, many Catholic priests had become peace activists, and Lim herself was a practicing Catholic, something that the North Korean media did not like to draw attention to. So, upon hearing of the dangerous situation Lim was putting herself into, the Catholic priesthood for the realization of justice issued statements in support of Lim's return to South Korea, and would even send an emissary to help protect Lim as she attempted to cross the DMZ. Several of the priests responsible for this would be arrested, but by this point it was too late. In early July, Father Moon Jae-in left South Korea to prepare to assist Lim with her attempt to cross the DMZ. Although he would officially enter North Korea on July 27th to march with Lim and her supporters as they descended on Panmunjom. However, the event turned out to be an anticlimax, as the South Korean and United Nations forces denied Lim's request to cross, and forced her to turn back. From here, Father Moon would become a much more present figure during Lim's fight to cross the DMZ, with the two forming a partnership and jointly claiming that the reason why their attempt had failed was because of meddling by the American imperialists.
평화를 수호한다는 이름하에 이 땅을 강점하고 있는 미제국주의자들, 그리고 이들의 횡계에 자신을 잃은 채 소위 이 땅을 지켜준다는 유엔의 사명감을 다시 한번 촉구하면서 미제국주의의 이 땅의 축출을 다시 한번 강력히 촉구하는 겁니다. 분단의 세력은 민족의 적이고, 이 적은 우리 앞에서 철저히 배격하고 저 없애버려야 한다는 사실을 또다시 오늘 이 자리에서 확인하게 됩니다.
통일만이 살 길이다. 조국 통일 이룩하자. 통일만이 살 길이다. 조국 통일 이룩하자.
Lim didn't want to abandon her quest to cross the DMZ, though. Lim decided that her next course of action would be to put pressure on the United Nations by starting a hunger strike. She would be joined by over 100 foreign activists who had remained in North Korea, and countless Korean supporters in both the North and the South. It did effectively put pressure on the South Korean government, as a special meeting was called at Panmunjom between the South Korean and United Nations commanders to discuss the Lim situation, while Jong-il members and supporters of Lim took to the streets to clash with police, demanding her safe passage back to South Korea. In the end, the South Korean and UN forces rejected Lim's demand to cross the DMZ, again citing the armistice agreement. And after several days without eating, Lim was hospitalized and is said to have been in a near comatose state. This again sparked fear amongst North Korean officials, with Lim claiming that while in the hospital, 2 North Korean officials approached her and informed her that Kim Il-sung had become very concerned for her health, and requested that she return home through a third country. Lim's response to this request didn't ease any of their anxieties, as she claimed she then turned to the window of her hospital room on the 37th floor and said that she wished to jump through it. With the North Korean leadership becoming increasingly nervous, and no sign of the South Korean and UN forces budging on the issue, it was decided that Lim would again try to cross the DMZ through Panmunjom, without any permission from South Korea. The date was set for August 15th, which was another anniversary date significant to Korean history, this time marking the end of Japanese occupation in 1945. In the days leading up to the 15th, Lim and Father Moon continued to rally support, as the South Korean media gave near daily updates on all their activities. And then, on August 15th, the big showdown happened, and it appeared that the South Korean and UN forces backed off. With their path home secure, Lim and Father Moon would give a joint, near hour-long speech, restating their desires for a unified homeland and calling on Koreans to continue the fight for unification in the face of all adversity. In her final moments in North Korea, an emotional Lim recited the peace prayer of St. Francis.
당신의 도구로 써주소서. 위험이 있는 곳에 사랑을, 다툼이 있는 곳에 용서를, 분열이 있는 곳에 일치를, 절망이 있는 곳에 희망을, 어두움에 빛을, 슬픔이 있는 곳에 기쁨을 가져오는 자 되게 하소서. 위로받기보다는 위로하고, 이해받기보다는 이해하며, 사랑받기보다는 사랑하게 하여 주소서. 우리는 줌으로써 받고, 용서함으로써 용서받으며, 자기를 버리고 죽음으로써 영생을 얻기 때문입니다. 이 모든 말씀 우리 주 예수 그리스도 이름으로 기나이다. 아멘.
And when she finished, she and Father Moon made history as they became the first two Korean citizens to openly cross the DMZ. They walked alone for a few yards before South Korean and United Nations forces arrested them and flew them by helicopter to Seoul for interrogation. For her 47-day adventure in North Korea, Lim Su-kyung would initially be sentenced to 10 years in prison, before having it reduced to 5 following an appeal. A similar sentence would be handed to Father Moon for his part in helping Lim cross the DMZ, and also handed to Im Jong-suk, who, after a 5-month manhunt, would finally be arrested in December of 1989. The story of the smuggled student representative had come to an end. Lim's involvement, the location of the festival, and the number of countries that participated made the 13th World Festival of Youth and Students arguably the most famous in the event's history. However, after being hosted in Pyongyang, the World Festival would start to wane in both relevance and prestige. This was primarily due to the end of the Cold War, which saw many of the countries that had supported the festival dissolve or change governments. The festival would be held again almost 10 years later in Havana, making Cuba the only country outside of Europe to host the festival twice. From here, the festivals would be sporadically held in multiple different countries, even finally being held on the continent of Africa. But the scale of the festivals were a lot smaller. Less flair, less participating nations, and less representatives. That is, until 2017, when Russia would host the festival, and not only outdo North Korea in terms of number of representatives, but also shatter their record for number of participating nations. I was unable to find any information about any future festivals, and given the fact the festival is not held on any consistent schedule, makes it hard to know exactly when the next festival will be, or if there will even be a next festival. In the lead up to and the initial aftermath of the festival, many outsiders predicted that this would be the beginning of an opening of North Korea. And the mass exposure to outside cultures and influences that North Korea experienced over the days of the festival was a genie that could not be put back in the bottle. But as we can see, that didn't happen. North Korea did, for a brief period, expose itself like it had not done before, but then very quickly shut itself off to most of the world again. There was no expansive outreach to nations that North Korea once considered an enemy or a rival. There was no massive economic reform that set North Korea on the path to joining the global markets. And there was no mass civilian uprising demanding liberalization or democracy. It seemed that North Korea was happy to take its victory from successfully hosting a massive global festival and then return to the way things were before. However, the festival wouldn't be the return to normal North Korea had hoped for. Instead, it would turn into a last hurrah for the country. Because a few months after the closing ceremony in Pyongyang, the Berlin Wall was torn down, as one by one the communist governments in Eastern Europe collapsed, leading to the dismantling of the Soviet Union, which had been the financial backer of several communist states around the world, including North Korea. This set up the 1990s to be one of the most difficult periods in North Korean history, as the North Korean economy fell apart, and the standard of living in North Korea collapsed along with it. I have seen some people online say that the reason that the North Korean economy collapsed so hard was due to the festival itself, given the expensive infrastructure programs that Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung ordered. However, this appears to be a massive exaggeration. Another shock would hit North Korea in the 90s with the death of its longtime leader, Kim Il-sung. Many had again hoped that with his heir, Kim Jong-il, in power, who had been characterized as a more Western-minded and metropolitan leader in the North Korean government, that North Korea would begin building relationships and alliances with former regional rivals now that the Cold War had officially ended. Kim Jong-il did end up attempting some diplomatic moves that, at the time, were seen as unprecedented. Some of them even involved the May 1st Stadium, that had been used to host the opening and closing ceremonies of the Festival of Youth and Students. In the year 2000, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright visited North Korea and attended the legendary North Korean Mass Games, which was performed at the stadium. However, the more bizarre use of the stadium came in 1995, a few weeks after the celebration of Kim Il-sung's birthday, with this being the first birthday for Kim Il-sung after his passing. The North Koreans decided as a follow-up to this celebration, they would host an international athletic performance, starring exclusively athletes from Japan and the United States. Given the history and relationship that these two countries have with North Korea, it's fair to ask who exactly would be headlining this event and what kind of
today and Kazuo Ishikawa.
The collision in Korea and the setup of how professional wrestlers from America and Japan ended up performing in the world's largest stadium in Pyongyang in front of a captive audience and guest of honor Muhammad Ali is a story that is beyond the scope of this video. If you are interested in learning more about this, there is a Vice documentary that is out about it. It's Season 3, Episode 4 of their Dark Side of the Ring series, as well as this YouTube video that is very popular. However, despite the boldness of these diplomatic actions, many of these maneuvers either backfired or stalled out and didn't lead to anything substantial. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, his legacy in the media was primarily focused around the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, as well as the worsening conditions of life in North Korea. And if you are interested in learning more about this event, No Tae-woo's term as president lasted until 1993. And due to Korean election laws, he was not allowed to run for a second term. He would be succeeded by Kim Young-sam, a prominent critic of Chun Doo-hwan who ran against No in the 1987 election. In an isolated and charitable context, you could say that No Tae-woo's presidency was fairly successful and dynamic, winning the country's first direct presidential election by a convincing margin, reversing several of the harsh restrictions put in place by his predecessors, successfully hosting the 1988 Olympics, normalizing relations with a large number of countries that would go on to become trade partners and allies in the post-Cold War political order, running South Korea during its last few years before the Asian economic crisis hit the country, and overseeing the country's first peaceful and legitimate transfer of power from one democratically elected president to the next. However, what would start off as an ethics probe ordered by President Kim against Chun Doo-hwan's administration and No Tae-woo's administration would turn into a corruption scandal that would engulf both presidents. This would snowball into a trial against both presidents for their involvement in the Gwangju massacre. In 1996, both would be found guilty for corruption and their role in killing several South Korean civilians, with Chun Doo-hwan receiving a death sentence that was later commuted to life in prison, and No Tae-woo being sent to 22 years in prison, which was later reduced to 17. Continuing the ongoing tradition of South Korean presidents having terrible endings. However, Chun and No did not remain in prison for very long, being pardoned after just 1 year. This was reportedly done as an attempt to unite the country and help South Korea move on from Gwangju, although both men were expected to repay the country for the money that they took. This move to pardon the two generals turned presidents was extremely controversial, but No Tae-woo decided to try to win back some of the public's confidence, apologizing a number of times for his role in the corruption scandal and paying off his legal fines in 2013. His successes in democratizing South Korea may be some of the reasons why No Tae-woo has a mildly more positive legacy than Chun Doo-hwan, who refused to pay back the country on the grounds that he was too poor, an excuse that rang hollow for much of the Korean public. Their joint ties to what happened in Gwangju in 1980 appear to have permanently tarnished the reputations of both these men, who refused to apologize and have tried to justify their actions, something that a significant portion of the Korean population find unexcusable. Both men would pass away a few months apart from each other in 2021. Despite the crackdowns following Lim's visit to North Korea, Jong-il remained active on many South Korean campuses, and continued their radical style of protests. This included hosting unification events that would end up clashing with the police, being connected to an attempted bombing of the American embassy, and smuggling more students into North Korea for various events. However, their numbers and relevance in South Korean politics waned during the 1990s, partially due to the reports that were coming out of North Korea following the collapse of the North Korean economy regarding stories of human rights abuses, as well as the lifting of Chun Doo-hwan-era travel restrictions on students. These elements, mixed with internal conflicts within the organization, led it to dissolve in 1993. The group that would end up succeeding Jong-il was a new student union called Han-chan-young that would continue to support left-wing youth causes in the country, but appears to have not reached the level of influence that Jong-il once held. Despite being sentenced to serve 5 years in prison, Father Moon was released early by No Tae-woo after serving only roughly 3 years. This was typical for many of the people that were arrested and sentenced for their involvement in Lim's illegal visit to North Korea. Most were released almost immediately or had their harsh sentences shortened significantly. Father Moon would even get a pardon from President Kim Yong-sam. I couldn't find many stories about what happened to Father Moon after being released. It would appear that he went back to being a priest and would occasionally engage in events or activities to promote peace. I did find that in the late 1990s, Father Moon was allowed to legally enter North Korea as part of some sort of Catholic cultural exchange program between the two countries. I found that he had participated in a hunger strike a few years ago, has marched in a few protests, but out of the big three that were arrested for their involvement in the illegal visit, he has kept the lowest profile. Im Jong-suk, the former leader of Jeondae-up, was released after serving 3.5 years of his sentence. After leaving prison and also being pardoned, Im returned to student organizing, connecting with a number of left-wing college student groups. However, as Im got older, he would transition into more mainstream politics, working for a number of positions and for different political parties before joining the Democratic Party of Korea, and become a powerful and influential figure within the organization. He would form a close relationship with a politician named Moon Jae-in, who, after failing to become president in 2012, losing to Park Geun-hye, the conservative daughter of former President Park Chung-hee, would be elected to the position in 2017, and appointed Im to positions in his cabinet, where Im would engage in diplomatic talks with some of the highest-ranking members of the North Korean government. In 2022, Moon Jae-in's party failed to win the South Korean presidency, narrowly losing to conservative Yoon Suk-yeol. This meant that Im wouldn't be carried over to the next administration, and I haven't found what he's been doing since leaving the government. After serving 3 years of a 5-year sentence, it was announced that Lim Su-kyung would be released from prison on Christmas in 1992. It was the first time that Lim had been allowed to return home since she left South Korea in the summer of 1989. Lim would start to move on with her life after prison by returning to university, even traveling abroad to study at Cornell University in the United States. She would start a career in journalism and even get married in 1995. Despite all these big changes in Lim's life, she still remained close to activism and unification political movements. Lim's trip to North Korea had made her a nationally recognized figure, and she would be asked to headline and participate in a number of events, sometimes reuniting with Father Moon or reconnecting with Im Jong-suk, who was pardoned alongside her in 1999. In 2001, Lim would be given the opportunity to return to North Korea, this time with permission from the government. It would be to attend a festival that was much smaller in size than the World Festival of Youth and Students, but still, North Korean officials that had been regularly asking South Korean diplomats for updates and assurances on Lim's health and condition were happy to have her return to the country. Although this time, the flower of reunification's presence in Pyongyang would be much more muted than it had been in 1989. Reports that North Korean media was downplaying or outright hiding Lim's return could be seen as examples as to how much North Korea had changed, but also an acknowledgement of some of its earlier mistakes. As mentioned before, when Lim first arrived in North Korea, she had unintentionally counter-signaled several of North Korea's talking points about living conditions in South Korea just from her appearance. Lim had continued to counter-signal North Korea even while on trial in South Korea for violating the National Security Act. And while North Korea did a lot to lionize Lim for her sacrifice and demonize the South Korean government for persecuting her, many North Koreans felt that her punishment of 5 years was relatively light. This was made worse when North Korean journalists visited South Korea to interview Lim's family about her treatment by the government.
Trying to capitalize on Lim Su-kyung's tremendous popularity, they had an interview with her parents, who lived in Seoul. This interview is widely remembered by the North Koreans, since it produced an explosive impact on their thinking about the South. North Koreans were surprised to discover that the family members of a political criminal were allowed to stay in their home in the capital city, keep their jobs, and talk freely to journalists. Having seen the interview, North Koreans began to suspect that South Korea was not only far more affluent than they were told. They also came to the conclusion that the ruling fascist clique in Seoul was unusually soft when dealing with the internal opposition. They wanted to show how popular their regime was in the South, but they ended up unwittingly providing proof of South Korean economic success and political freedom.
It had become clear that despite the sacrifices Lim herself made to attend the festival in '89 and promote the country, and the individual feelings of North Koreans across the entire population, it was seen as more politically advantageous to passively phase Lim out of mainstream consciousness. And while there are rumors of behind-the-scenes conflict that disrupted this visit to North Korea, it has been noted that discussion and reports on Lim had pretty much ceased in North Korea in the mid-90s, several years before this visit. The 2000s would also see a decline in Lim's relevance in South Korean mainstream culture as well, although a few notable things happened to her during this period. At some point, Lim had made connections with the legendary South Korean filmmaker Park Chan-wook, who had become famous for directing action movies and thrillers such as Old Boy, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and would later direct The Handmaiden. Lim would be given a non-speaking cameo appearance in his 2005 movie Lady Vengeance, where she would play a guard in a female prison, in what appears to be an obvious reference to Lim's own arrest and imprisonment in 1989. The film would go on to be nominated for several awards and win the Blue Dragon Film Award for Best Movie. You would think that participating in a critically acclaimed film would make 2005 a fantastic year for Lim, but would actually turn out to be one of Lim's most difficult, because in that same year, Lim's son tragically died in an accident while on vacation in the Philippines. If this wasn't difficult enough, Lim would enter into legal action against a number of, quote, malicious netizens who still held a grudge against Lim for traveling to North Korea, and who had left several comments online attacking and mocking Lim for the loss of her son. The courts would end up siding with Lim and fining several of the netizens, forcing them to financially compensate Lim for emotional damages. However, the experience was obviously traumatizing for Lim, and she would appear to retreat from the public eye for several years, although still occasionally making some public appearances or being reported on for some new legal suit. The early 2010s, though, would be Lim's big comeback. In 2011, she would appear on a debate show to argue in favor of repealing the National Security Act. And while this would garner Lim some attention, especially her comments on what had been dubbed the Wang Jae-san espionage investigations, the following year would be the biggest one for Lim since 1989. In 2012, the documentary La Chica del Sur, made by Argentinian filmmaker José Luis Garcia, was released. The documentary showed Lim's journey through North Korea and wanted to show what she had been doing in the modern day, while also displaying the struggles that the filmmakers had getting Lim to cooperate with the production. The film would be a hit amongst critics who praised the director for his passion, honesty, and the ending interview that he managed to get with Lim.
1명 이상의 사람 앞에서도 이야기를 해본 적이 없고 나는 뭐 이렇게 토론을 활발하게 한다거나 뭔가 이렇게 대중 연설을 하던 사람이 전혀 아니고 그냥 글을 잘 썼어요. 소설에 당선이 돼서 이게 소설처럼.
2012 would also be the year that Lim, allegedly with the help of Im Jong-suk, would become an elected assemblywoman for the Democratic Party of Korea. Lim would finally be in a place of mainstream power and influence and have the ability to affect change on a government level. However, that same year, Lim would be involved in a scandal that threatened to overshadow her accomplishments. In June of 2012, a North Korean defector named Paek Yo-sep went to Facebook to describe an interaction he had with Lim. While at a restaurant, Paek noticed Lim and her entourage eating, and approached the newly elected assemblywoman for a photo, wanting to get the photo not only because of the impact that Lim had had on North Korea, but also because the two had come face to face on the aforementioned debate show. Lim agreed to take the photo, but when Paek was leaving, someone who identified themselves as a waiter at the restaurant approached Paek, asking if he could check to see if the photos were appropriate. The waiter ended up deleting many of Paek's photos without his permission, and Paek confronted Lim about the incident, saying he made a joke about North Korean firing squads to explain the situation, but would end up enraging Lim.
I asked Lim Su-kyung whether it was her who had asked directly for the photo deletion. She said,
Did I? I never said such a thing.
Deleting information from someone's phone on one's own initiative is a complete infringement of one's privacy.
Those guys are my aides, so please understand that they are here to keep an eye out on me. to protect against any minor civil suits.
You know what would have happened in a situation like this back home in North Korea? Immediate execution by firing squad, or would they do this as they pleased, without the leader having commanded it?
Who are you?
Ms. Lim, we were on the Park Ji-in's debate show. I am the North Korean defector student.
You don't know anything, so don't be so frivolous. Did you know that the Republic of Korea is a democratic republic? How dare you, baseless North Korean defector, talk back to me, a National Assembly member? They aren't you. And that Tae-woo doing that strange North Korean human rights activity thing. Tae-woo, that son of a bitch, he is a real betrayer.
Excuse me, who? Who betrayed whom? You are saying that Representative Tae-woo and the rest of us defectors betrayed that murderer Kim Il-sung, who they all call father, right? I've nothing to say whatsoever.
You son of a bitch. You senseless North Korean defector, how dare you to talk back to me, a National Assembly member? You have come to South Korea, so shut the fuck up, and live quietly, you bastard betrayer. You watch your back. Got it?
The fallout from this interaction would be immediate, as she was roundly condemned by conservative politicians and by a large section of the Korean public. Lim would apologize for the interaction and clarify that the firing squad comment is what triggered her hostile response, and later imply that some of the things that were written about her were exaggerated. But that didn't quell the anger against her, as Lim found herself becoming a lightning rod for criticism and mockery, with many people juxtaposing her comments with her past interactions with the North Korean government. It is for this reason why people think Lim Su-kyung was essentially pushed out of office by her own party in 2016, serving only one term as an assemblywoman. The last major thing that Lim did in this time was release a book about herself, titled Lim Su-kyung's Story, and was co-written with journalist Ji Seong-ho. The book is essentially one long interview with Lim, where she would tell stories about her life and her experiences in North Korea, as well as set the record straight about some past events, and also speak her mind on current political topics. It would appear that after this book was released, Lim would again disappear from mainstream relevance and discussion, privating or abandoning almost all of her social media accounts, and appearing to focus on publishing children's books. She still does appear to have some elevated status amongst peace activists in South Korea, based on photos from events that she attended post-2016, but may feel that her time engaging in Korean politics in any large way is over. But at this point, it's all just speculation. Lim's historic border crossing still occasionally gets brought up in the news, usually when discussing the history of inter-Korean relations, or if there is some new context or revelation to her story. Lim's post-1989 exploits are also sometimes brought up, mostly from what I've seen as a humorous pop culture reference. And this man did a video on her. I have no idea what it says, but it appears that it's popular. So Lim hasn't been completely removed from the mainstream, but it appears that she largely might be done interacting with the mainstream. The legacy of Lim Su-kyung is interesting to analyze, because it is split between two nations that desire to be one, and her legacy in both of them is running up against some unique obstacles. Those in North Korea that were alive during the World Festival of Youth and Students seem to fondly remember and appreciate Lim, and still respect her as a heroic figure. But the government sees her legacy as a problem, and appears to be attempting to erase it. While in South Korea, Lim's legacy appears to be split along a political axis, between conservatives who oppose North Korea, and more left-wing minded unification supporters, with each group viewing Lim as either a traitor or a martyr, respectively. What will be interesting to see is how the next few generations of South Korea view the unification activists of the 80s and 90s, growing up in a time so far removed from the Cold War, as well as a time when those who were alive during the Korean War and the Japanese occupation are dwindling in numbers. Although this summary of Lim's legacy may be a bit premature, as we may see her legacy live on in North Korea as those students who watched her in 1989 enter into the government and high-ranking positions of power, and could bring about some cultural or diplomatic changes that alter North Korea fundamentally. There could even be further developments in the South, as it's been revealed that the government has been refusing to declassify documents related to the Lim smuggling in 1989. There's been some that have demanded that these documents be declassified for transparency's sake, but the issue is either locked up in the courts or completely stalled out. Will there be something in these documents that completely changes the country's perception of Lim and the 1989 festival? I don't know. As I said before, this is all just speculation. What I think can be appreciated, that no matter what you think about Lim Su-kyung, the festival, North Korea, no Tae-woo, Jeondaeop, is that all of these elements came together to create a perfect storm for a very interesting story. One that I thought was worth sharing.